June 19, 1944, 10:22 a.m. The Philippine Sea, 150 nautical miles west of the island of Saipan. The bridge of the Imperial Japanese aircraft carrier Taiho was a cathedral of quiet tension. The air, cooled by internal circulation, carried the faint, oily sense of machinery and fresh paint. Sunlight streamed through the armored glass, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the still air. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa stood motionless, his hands clasped behind the stiff wool of his service jacket. His gaze was fixed not on the deep blue sea below, but on the empty, punishingly vast blue sky above. Behind him, the operational pulse of the bridge thrummed softly, the rustle of a plotted course on a map, the low murmur of a status report. Ozawa's plan, Operation A-Go, was in motion. It was elegant, aggressive. His carriers, positioned beyond the range of American carrier aircraft, a calculation based on flight manuals and past battles, would launch their strikes. His planes would then recover on the island airfields of Guam and Rota, rearm, and strike the American fleet again on their return flight. It was a shuttle service of destruction, leveraging geography like a master swordsman uses terrain. Now, the first wave was out. Somewhere ahead, over that curved horizon, over 200 of his aircraft, Zero fighters, Judy dive bombers, Jill torpedo bombers, were pressing toward Task Force 58. Many of the pilots crowding those cockpits were veterans of the early, triumphant campaigns. Theirs were the faces from newsreels, the hands that had rained fire on Pearl Harbor and chased the British from the Indian Ocean. They were the Kokutai, the naval air arm, the very soul of Japanese naval power. Ozawa had sent his soul out to duel. The first crackle of radio reports was not unexpected. Contact. The enemy combat air patrol was sighted. The narrative in Ozawa's mind began to write itself, a furious, swirling dogfight, a testament to individual samurai spirit overcoming numerical odds. He expected the reports to speak of closing distances, of twisting maneuvers, of the chattering of machine guns and cannon. Instead, the reports that began to filter back were wrong. They were fragments of confusion, pieces of a puzzle that didn't fit the tactical picture. Enemy fighters, above. They came out of the sun. A pause, filled with static that was louder than words. They are not waiting. They are intercepting. We are not yet in visual range of the target fleet. Then, a voice, strained, breaking through. They are everywhere. It's an ambush. On the radar plots, the blips representing his first wave began to stutter, to fade, not in a slow attrition, but in a rapid, sickening dissolution. They were disappearing before they had even seen the American warships, before the great anti-aircraft guns had even begun to roar. Ozawa's brow furrowed slightly. His intelligence officers had spoken of the Hellcats' robustness, of their numbers. This was to be a battle of quality against quantity, of will against materiel. But this was different. This was not a battle. It was a systematic vanishing. The American fighters weren't just patrolling, they were being delivered. They are arriving with an unerring predatory certainty, vectoring onto his formations as if guided by an all-seeing eye. He leaned forward, placing his palms on the cool chart table. The quiet on the bridge deepened, becoming thick, heavy. The only sound was the faint, desperate chorus from the radio speaker, a chorus that was being silenced, voice by voice, mile by mile from the safety of the carrier deck. The elegant plan, the leveraging of distance began to feel like a tragic miscalculation. The technological chasm wasn't something you could see on a spec sheet. It was being revealed here, in real time, in the silent spaces between the dying radio transmissions. June 20th, 1944. Dusk. Aboard the heavy cruiser, Haguro. The air in the flag cabin was thick with the scent of stale sweat, salt, and defeat. Admiral Ozawa sat, back straight, before a chart that was now a memorial to a broken fleet. The ink lines tracing his grand strategy seemed to mock him. To his staff, he presented a mask of stoic resolve, but in the quiet, his mind replayed the day's horrors on a relentless loop. The silent radios, the erupting deck of the Taiho, the empty sky. The tactical post-mortem was a brutal, clinical affair. The numbers were irrefutable. In 2 days of battle, the Imperial Japanese Navy had lost over 90% of its committed carrier aircraft, nearly 600 planes. 3 frontline carriers, including his flagship, were on the bottom. American losses were negligible. More chilling than the material loss was the method. His pilots, the finest he had, never had a chance to fight. They were harvested from the sky by an enemy who saw them coming from over 100 miles away. This was the core of Ozawa's realization. It wasn't just about more ships or better planes. The Americans had built a new kind of battlefield, a networked battlefield. A radar picket destroyer would see his formations. That data would flow via secure radio to a combat information center aboard a carrier. There, trained officers would plot intercepts and vector out Hellcats not to patrol, but to kill with surgical precision. His carriers launched individual arrows. The Americans operated a single, intelligent, distributed organism. How do you fight a god that sees all? For Ozawa, the answer lay in stripping away the very concepts of modern warfare. If technology and training were lost causes, only 2 elements remained: surprise and sacrifice. You had to get inside the enemy's decision-making loop, to move so fast from so close that the all-seeing radar became a chaotic blur, and the weapon could no longer be a machine operated by a man hoping to return. The weapon had to be the man. The concept was not new. Isolated, desperate pilots had already been crashing their damaged planes into enemy ships for months. They called it tokko, special attack. But until this moment, it had been an act of final, individual defiance, not a sanctioned strategy. As Ozawa stared at the chart, the math of total war became clear. A conventional bomb or torpedo delivered by a pilot trying to survive had a dismally low probability of hitting a maneuvering, defended warship. But a plane, guided by a living, thinking pilot in its final seconds, its engine at full throttle, became a precision weapon of terrifying reliability. 1 plane, 1 ship. It was a horrific calculus. The value of a pilot's life was reduced to a statistical probability of a hit. But in the face of the American technological juggernaut, it was the only variable Japan still controlled in abundance: its will to die. Ozawa did not make this decision alone. The seeds had already been sown in the halls of the Naval General Staff in Tokyo, where other minds, facing the same stark reality, were reaching the same monstrous conclusion. But the Marianas Turkey Shoot was the catalyst, the brutal, empirical proof that no other path existed. When Ozawa sent his after-action report, it was not just a record of loss, it was a data point in the argument for organized mass suicide. The admiral, a career officer who had studied Nelson and Mahan, who understood fleet tactics and gunnery solutions, now became an architect of a new, dreadfully simple doctrine. He would recommend the formal, systematic creation of the kamikaze. The divine wind would not be a metaphor for hope, but a tactical manual. The pilot was no longer a warrior, he was a fuse. The plane was no longer an aircraft, it was a guided missile with a human brain in its final, glorious, terrible seconds of life. As the Haguero steamed westward away from the debacle, the first formal proposals for dedicated special attack units were already being drafted. The machinery of desperation was grinding into motion. In a few short months, the skies off the Philippines would darken not with formations of bombers, but with a storm of young men on one-way journeys, their desperate hope forged in the fire of Ozawa's utter defeat. October 25, 1944, 7:25 a.m. The sky above Leyte Gulf, the Philippines. The sun climbs over a slate-gray sea. Aboard the escort carriers of Taffy 3, a thin American screen of jeep carriers and destroyers, the morning watch sips coffee. Radar sweeps paint a clean, empty scope. It is a quiet morning after days of thunderous naval battle. Then a lone blip appears, then another. Soon the scope blooms with hostile contacts, closing fast from the west. The air is suddenly torn by the shriek of general quarters. This is the harvest of Ozawa's realization. This is the divine wind. The first kamikaze of the Shikishima unit, a Zero fighter loaded with a 550-pound bomb, emerges from a low cloud. It does not weave, it does not climb for a bombing run. It simply descends, engine shrieking at full war emergency power, in a near-vertical dive toward the flight deck of the USS St. Lo. Anti-aircraft guns, the very system that had been part of the network defense at the Marianas, open up. Tracers stitch the sky, but the plane, guided by a living, correcting hand, plunges through the storm of steel. The impact is a volcanic explosion of flame, fuel, and bomb fragments that gut the carrier. Within 30 minutes, the USS St. Lo slips beneath the waves, the first major warship sunk solely by a sanctioned kamikaze attack. Across Taffy 3, the same horror repeats. The USS Kalinin Bay is struck and burns. The USS Kitkun Bay is narrowly missed by a plane that parts the deck like a scythe. The Americans are facing an enemy who has changed the fundamental rules of engagement. The goal is no longer to survive to fight again. The goal is a one-for-one trade, a $50,000 aircraft and a pilot's life for a $50 million carrier and 1,000 souls. In a dimly lit operations room in Japan, months earlier, Vice Admiral Ozawa is present not in body, but in spirit. His analysis from the Marianas has been codified, industrialized. Young men, some with barely 100 hours of flight time, are shown his reports. They are shown diagrams of American radar coverage, of fighter interception zones. Their training is stripped of all nuance. Takeoff, formation flying, and the final long dive. They are taught how to aim for the elevator or the bridge, where a hit will cause the most catastrophic damage. They are weapons now. Their briefing officers use the word certainty. A 10% hit rate for conventional bombers becomes an 80% certainty for a kamikaze. The math, born of Ozawa's desperation, is cold, clear, and compelling to a nation on the brink. The legacy of June 19, 1944 is not just the loss of the Taiho, it is the institutionalization of a terrible logic. At Leyte Gulf, and for the remainder of the war, over 3,000 kamikaze pilots would sortie. They would sink 47 ships, damage 300 more, and claim the lives of nearly 7,000 Allied sailors. They were the human counter-algorithm to American radar, a storm of consciousness meant to overwhelm the cool electronic gaze of the enemy. But the very desperation that made them potent also sealed their strategic failure. The kamikaze could inflict terrifying wounds, but it could not sink the industrial leviathan that was the United States. For every carrier damaged, a new one was commissioned. For every pilot lost, Japan had one less to defend its own burning cities from the raining fire of B-29s. Admiral Ozawa survived the war. He would be interrogated by Allied officers who sought to understand the mind of their foe. One can only wonder what passed through his thoughts in those quiet moments. Did he recall the clean, hopeful morning on the Taiho's bridge? Did he hear, in his memory, the silent radios of the Turkey Shoot? The decision he helped forge to trade spirit for steel, to answer radar with ramming, was the final, tragic confession of a modern navy that had seen the future and found itself obsolete. The divine wind blew. It shook the world, but it could not change the tide.